Canada's immigration system is even more broken than I thought. We've poured in record immigration levels, but according to a recent report by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, 1 in 5 newcomers leaves Canada, with much of the losses occurring in the first 5 years. Highly educated and in-demand professionals are the likeliest immigrants to pack up and leave. So to put it bluntly, Canada has done a great job at recruiting talent, but we've failed spectacularly at keeping it here. And this exodus is compounded by glaring blind spots in data in Canada. In late 2025, Statistics Canada quietly admitted that the 2021 census missed 38% of all non-permanent residents, roughly 500,000 people. Enough citizens to fill the city of Halifax were likely missed in the census. And if you combine that gap with the ongoing non-permanent residents' departures, Canada's actual population growth and workforce picture looks very different. Economists now actually estimate that nearly 1 million people may be overstaying on expired visas. This is a hidden population that never left the system on paper. In short, our immigration leaks go two ways. We have skilled newcomers leaving and rising numbers of undocumented residents quietly accumulating. So let's start by looking at the first report here, the Leaky Bucket 2025, which charts the great exodus of the more high-skilled immigrants in Canada. The ICC's report uses 40 years of IRCC and census data to quantify these leaks, as they call it. And I would say this is a pretty worrying picture, regardless of your stance on immigration. The fact that the hardest people for us to keep here are the ones that are the most qualified and the ones who would contribute most to our economy is a problem from my perspective. The strongest surge of leavers happens within the first 5 years after landing in Canada. Chart 2 in the report shows onward migration rates zoom from near zero in year 1. Obviously, that's when people are arriving to a peak around year 5. In other words, Canada loses a disproportionate share of newcomers almost immediately before they could fully settle or integrate. And there's a lot of speculation that this is people who are coming here to get citizenship, use the resources of Canada's economy, and then either return home or go to an economy that has more economic promise for them. Chart 3 in the report shows that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to leave Canada. Doctorate holders are nearly twice as likely to exit Canada as those with a bachelor's degree. About 34% of PhD level immigrants eventually depart versus roughly 19% of bachelor's level over 25 years. In short, our smartest newcomers are the first to move on from Canada. And they also break this down on an occupational basis. Even with occupations, certain roles drain the fastest. And if I list these to you, it would be probably the ones that you might think are most important for us to keep in Canada. Legislative and senior managers have by far the highest exit rates. Roughly 35% leave within a 25-year period. Other high loss fields include tech and health, for example, natural and applied scientists, healthcare workers, business and finance managers, all see 24 to 28% leaving within 20. By contrast, trades, manufacturing, natural resources occupations have far lower outbound rates. Ironically, the fastest growing occupations, the jobs that Canada most needs to fill, also have the most substantial attrition. Chart 7 shows us that the top 25 fastest growing jobs from 2025 until 2035, from data science and healthcare managers to computer developers and engineering managers. And it shows that all of them are facing non-trivial exit rates. And this is typically because Canada's wage environment isn't exceptionally good for high demand skills, where people do have a marketable skill and job. They can often go to the US and make more money. And a lot of people, newcomers to Canada, use Canada as a pathway to get to the US. It would change them from an H-1B specialty occupation visa to a TN visa system, which allows for migration from USMCA countries. And nobody's really discussed this, but I've always wondered whether or not this is one of the components of the USMCA that Trump has an issue with, given that they've really been clamping down on the H-1B visa system. And a lot of skilled talent that comes from Waterloo, especially in Canada, like a lot of our young tech students that are coming up, go to Silicon Valley, they go there on a TN, not on an H-1B. And it's similar if you are an international student who comes to Canada, given our international student system has been super lenient over the last couple of years. get an engineering degree at Waterloo. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying this. It's a very difficult thing to do. And you would be able to go to the US on a TN visa rather than an H-1B, which is a much simpler process. So the problem here is that the fields that we've guaranteed massive growth in Canada are still losing talent. It's not compelling for people with super marketable skill sets in high growth career paths to want to stay here. And we need to be asking ourselves, why is that? Chart 10 also shows us that retention varies by province. The Atlantic provinces are the worst. Atlantic Canada loses like 37% of immigrants by 25 years, the highest exit rate of any region. Ontario's 25-year rate is about 22%, and BC is about 27.8%. Western provinces do better, probably because they have a lower cost of living relative to wages there, and affordability does tend to be a huge issue with people moving to Canada, especially when comparing against and competing against other places that they could go to work, such as the US, where you can afford to live on the wage that they'd be getting within their career. They're probably making more money, wages are higher there, and their housing costs are substantially lower in most places. So all of this together, the charts and this report from the Leaky Bucket paint a pretty stark reality from my perspective that Canada's talent pipeline is full of leaks. And this is sort of let's call it the good side of immigration. These are the people that you really wish were staying in Canada. We recruit highly skilled people and even steer them into high demand jobs only to see them depart at alarming rates when they're able to experience upward mobility in their career as a result of coming to Canada. Now let's jump over to the other side of the leak. And the leak is growing undocumented populations in Canada. I've already done a handful of videos on this on YouTube, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. But while we fret over permanent residents exiting, there's also a dark flip side, which is that Canada has no good handle on who stays beyond their visa. And I think that this was really just further evidenced by the fact that Statistics Canada recently admitted that they missed 38% of non-citizens in the last census. Leading economists such as Benjamin Tao from CIBC has been sounding the alarm on this reality for a long time, citing as early as 2022, 2023, that we were potentially nearly 1 million people could be living in Canada on expired permits that we didn't know about or hadn't documented. And these are mostly international students and temporary workers who simply never left. And so it really begs the question, with something like 4.9 million visas expiring over the next couple of years, the feds are basically expecting the holders of these visas to just leave voluntarily, even though we have evidence that would show that they're not doing that. Now, Canada does have the technical ability to track exits. The Canada Border Services Agency, or CBSA, has maintained electronic exit records at airports and border crossings for over 6 years. But surprisingly, this data is not being used for immigration policy or released publicly, according to Canvas Immigration. So in practice, when a student's permit or work visa runs out, there's often no enforcement push to remove them. And this is a blind spot that Canada can't really afford, right? It massively distorts our labor market, our housing and social service planning, and fuels anti-immigrant sentiment. And when we don't have the resources, or we don't even know the number of people that we're providing resources for, it's pretty easy to understand how that could become a problem. And so we effectively have no system to reverse the tap on immigration, even though we've mentioned how we're expecting to see this record number of non-permanent residents leave Canada, even though I think 50% of permanent residents issuances came from non-permanent residents. So we're functionally actually turning a lot of those expired visas into permanent residents if they qualify. But without systematic exit tracking, the IRCC can't say how many people have left or overstayed. And this was illustrated in that StatCan release that showed that in the 2021 census coverage for non-permanent residents, it was so poor that official growth projections were way off. And in Congress, IRCC officials now admit that there are no accurate figures on the undocumented population in Canada. Meanwhile, the actual enforcement or transitioning of these visas is super lax. Even as student permits mushroomed, government did not ramp up removals or even track how many students simply vanish. For example, media reports in late 2025 highlighted that a 31,000 person postgraduate work permit expiration will take place by next year with no clear plan from Ottawa on how to handle it. In effect, we're allowing tens of thousands of temporary workers to drop off the radar. By contrast, the US and other countries have faced political pressure to deport visa overstayers, which we're seeing a ton of right now, and tighten the entry and exit. This is probably the biggest theme happening in the US right now. And I've always felt it's interesting. The whole thing in the US really started with the Mariel boat lift in Miami. And a Canadian economist by the name of David Card did a study on the impact of the Mariel boat lift on the Miami labor market. This was like one of the first times. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix show Griselda, but like where she has those like Marielitos that they're all a bunch of criminals, basically. Castro just said, we're just going to get rid of them. And they just started shipping boats of criminals from their prisons to Miami. And it increased Miami's labor force by like 7% overnight. It was, I think, in the 70s or 80s. And it actually didn't have a massive noticeable impact on like wages, et cetera. And it always makes like, is that because they didn't actually pull wages down, or is it because they were not actually real members, like documented members of the economy, and so they wouldn't be working professions that would show up in wage data, right? And this is like because the US has this huge undocumented population, and these are all people who are consuming things, working jobs for cash that don't show up in the economy. It could actually skew the US GDP per capita, growth per capita, wealth, productivity per capita up. And honestly, in Canada, and this is maybe a little bit too conspiratorial, but with a country that has so much pressure from central banks and just the voting public on being super unproductive and having a super low GDP per capita growth, actually negative falling GDP per capita, it wouldn't surprise me if I was a politician. It would be a decent way to skew those numbers substantially. Would be to be basically creating this massive undocumented workforce in a country. I'm not saying that's necessarily what they're doing, but I think the incentives are certainly aligned if they wanted to. All of this to say that these leaks are starting to have consequences. A large untracked, undocumented population heightens calls for tougher enforcement. We're already seeing this from provincial leaders who are urging Ottawa to consider exclusions or visa restrictions to make space for Canadian citizens. And the narrative is shifting, especially in regards to the US. Obviously, President Trump has repeatedly used harsh language about Western immigration. In this 2025 UN speech, he warned Europe and Canada that uncontrolled migration is destroying our heritage and urged an end to open borders. And he has also specifically demanded that Canada secure its shared border to prevent illegal crossings. While Canada is not the US or Europe, the examples obviously show where the rhetoric and policy is heading. The rules are tightening. Ottawa's already cut new student permits. And if Canadian retention of the higher quality newcomers stays as dismal as it is today, we could see rising pressure to treat overstayers similarly to what we're seeing in the US. And it's not like the idea of deportation is new here. Like when this policy first passed, there were massive protests because of the risk of deportation, protests from international students nationwide. Now, the last piece that I'll touch on here that I found the most interesting was StatCan recently put out a report November 13th, so about just over a month ago. So basically, we're starting to see continued demographic effects of immigration. I only saw one media cover this. I think it was CTV, and they got roasted pretty hard for it. So I'm going to tread carefully with this one. But basically, they published that 42.3% of Canadian newborns in 2024 had a foreign-born mother, which is just like, it's crazy when you hear it represented in data. And I would be curious, like the data sets that they published here doesn't go back as far as like the baby boom. I'm going to try and find, it goes back to 1997, but you can basically see this steady climb from about 22% of Canadians were born to a foreign-born mother, and it's now over 40%. And this would just say that, like culturally, the birth rates of newcomers to Canada would be a lot higher than domestic Canadians, which is a reflection of the demographic crisis that we know that we're facing here. I'd be curious to see what this looked like for the baby boom. Just as a personal example, my dad's parents are both immigrants to Canada. And I would imagine that many of the families born or the children born during the baby boom might be in comparable situations just because everybody was leaving Europe from the war during that period of time and coming to the US and Canada. So I would be super interested to see what that data looked like for that period of time. But nonetheless, more than 2 in 5 babies born in the last year were born to immigrant women in Canada. We don't have this for both parents, obviously, so that's just why I'm using the word women rather than both parents. It's just the data set. The share nearly doubled since 1997 when it was 22.5%, which means that Canada's population renewal is now overwhelmingly driven by immigrants, both in fertility and migration. And this is something that like policymakers and demographers will talk a lot about. And I've always wondered, I mentioned this a couple of times on the channel, like, why do we need a growing population? My guess is that Canada is at risk of having an underfunded pension system similar to Europe. Like if you look at Europe here, their underfunded pension obligations, household pension entitlements in social insurance, and underfunded pension entitlements in major European countries are now 300 to 500% of GDP. And if you combine that with collapsing demographics, it becomes this sort of perfect storm. And I really think that policymakers are trying to temper with the fact that they obviously messed up in hindsight, maybe not them, but previous generations of policymakers who designed these systems messed up and they couldn't deliver a high enough return. And they made promises to future retirees that they couldn't keep. And they now need more people to pay into that system than people who are taking money out of that system. And so I don't think that capitalism actually depends on more consumers. I think it depends on more growth in capital and wealth, which we've seen through money printing, currency debasement, the fractional reserve banking system, et cetera. But I think that our entitlement system in Canada very much depends on more people working more jobs, paying more taxes to keep the pension system from ending up like one of these European pension systems, because we're really just like 20 years behind a lot of these countries. Our population's a little bit younger, we're growing a little bit faster, but as our birth rate begins to collapse, and this is something that I've been paying attention to, not just in Europe, not just in Canada, but around the world. Like China is a really good example of a country that China's demography is breaking so quickly that they're losing the equivalent of an entire European country in population every year as China starts to die off. Like the ripple effects of the populations shrinking around the world, I think is like, I am of the opinion that we're actually getting to the end of growth and that we almost need to rethink our entire system. I don't know what it is, and it's not communism, by the way, but it's like we have built this system that of capitalism that depends on perpetual growth in people, which is consumption, workers, and capital. And if those things are breaking and they can't be replaced with anything like, or it seems like domestic populations in Canada and Europe and the US are not super receptive to the idea of growing the populations through this system, the only other system that we figured out, which is immigration, right? By bringing people there. Because you think about like who would be on deck. So like we saw a lot of migration from China, which was the fastest growing place on earth. Then we see a lot of migration from India, which is the newer kind of fastest growing place on earth. But even India has sort of fallen below the replacement rate. So if you sort of look at like your Indias of the world, India, I think just fell. So replacement rate's 2.1 births per household. India just fell below that rate. You're starting to see like basically your red countries here are the places where you would still be sort of close to or above. Where would be the next place that we would need to see mass immigration from in the Western world would be, you'd start looking at bringing people from, so we went from, let's say, China, the fastest growing, where you saw a huge migration of people from China into Canada and the US and much of the Western world, Anglosphere. Then you saw India. Then the next would be Africa, which we're already seeing. Like I think Nigeria is really ramping up as one of the largest sources of migration into Canada, at least for international students. It just feels like one of those things that I think ends up being like a tough sell for policymakers to say, hey, we're just going to keep moving where we're growing our population from. And I've mentioned a handful of times on the show is like, are there better solutions for people to encourage people to have more kids? But I don't know if it's necessary. Like I personally am super into having kids, want to be a dad, think it's a super necessary part of life, but there's a lot of people who don't feel that way, and maybe they necessarily shouldn't be having kids, right? So all in all, from my perspective, I don't think we can keep pouring water into an immigration bucket that is full of holes. Canada can either lose all of these newcomers, figuratively or literally, lose them to going elsewhere, or lose them because we don't know where they've gone now that their visa's expired, or we can change policy to either keep them and make our immigration system sensible and acceptable to Canadians. given that we already have the data, there's been a lot of calls for Ottawa to adopt a data-driven retention and tracking framework and integrate exit analytics, obviously, and give provinces and employers the tools they need to keep people here and keep track of them. I think the alternative is a perpetual spiral, higher immigration targets, but weaker growth, weaker quality, loss of public confidence, which we've already seen in the immigration system in Canada. It really went from an immigration system that was probably the envy of the world to basically, you know, probably the most severe example. Maybe Europe has some better examples, but one of the most severe examples of overdoing it and almost actively stoking anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada. And I think our future really depends on fixing this system. Obviously, like the easy thing is to say, oh, well, why can't Canadians just have more kids? But I think the answer to that question, which I've highlighted many times on the channel, is most people simply can't afford to, right? If you don't have space or money, the idea of bringing a kid into the world seems pretty scary. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks a lot for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you again as soon as I can.